Hello, fellow Ozians. It's been a while. Life took a slightly unexpected turn not long after I finished reading The Magic of Oz that sort of derailed things. And I always intended to come back, and, well, here we are. So do forgive my late absence. I would have preferred to have timed it to finish Glinda of Oz and have a break between Baum and Thompson like that. But such is life. One of the things I'm sure you can tell, I'm in a different location. We have moved since the last video. I also got my hair all cut off, so a whole lot of things going on. So I'm back with Glinda of Oz, as well as a couple of interesting announcements that I think will be maybe of interest to those of you who watch these. So first and foremost, if by some chance you're new to our channel, I don't know why you would be new to the channel and join in on Glinda of Oz, but hey, I am not going to stop you. Although I would recommend going back to the beginning and watching from there. So the first big announcement of sorts, I started up about a month or so ago a Instagram profile for my Oz book collection. Partially because I felt like I needed to do something with what I've got. Partially so that, God forbid something should happen, I can at least point to those pictures and say, well, this is what I had. And to try and get, to a degree, an actual, visual reference to a bunch of the different editions. So I'm actually finishing up tomorrow. We'll finish up the Baum books, at least in terms of early printings. There's a whole plan for how things are going to go. So you'll get to see if you watch it today, you're getting a sneak preview, I guess, of tomorrow's Instagram post. The Instagram is Road of Yellow Books, so at Road of Yellow Books. And I post Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And on Fridays, I post sort of the fun picture books, different adaptations, foreign editions, etc., etc. So, not the ones that fall under the Riley and Lee or major printings. Or at least what I'm classifying as major printings. There is a chance I may restart up the blog, but we'll see. I'm not sure I have the time for that, but we'll see. Make no promises. As well as that, I co-founded with my friend Mikey a Facebook group called The Yellow Book. I can talk. The Yellow Book Road, the Literary World of Oz. Please feel free to come join us. We basically are primarily talking about books. Obviously, and their subsequent adaptations where it's appropriate. We are trying very carefully to avoid much discussion of the MGM film, because there's lots of venues for that and very few that are strictly book-related. Additionally, because of the wonderful world of COVID, there are 2 virtual conventions. One I'm participating in, one I am not. One is this weekend. It's the Winky Convention, or known as OzCon International. And then there's one I don't think we've got the dates totally firmed up, but it'll be next month, and that'll be the International Wizard of Oz Club's convention. And I'm hosting a panel and doing a photo gallery for that one. So, kind of exciting. So, there we go. Alright, so, let's talk about what we're here to talk about. Glinda of Oz. This time I actually read a sort of an interesting one. It's a first edition, but it's the Canadian edition, which was published simultaneously. Interestingly, while there were 4 titles that were reprinted in the 50s, specifically in Canada, all of the Canadian releases were actually printed here in the US with the Canadian publisher label information on it. So it's identical to, except for the publisher imprint on the spine and on the copyright page. I can get my pages to turn correctly. There. Opposite a very lovely drawing of Dorothy, Ozma, and Glinda in Glinda's Palace. So, Glinda of Oz is the last of Baum's books. Royal Book of Oz erroneously claims to be his. We will discuss that when we get to that book next, which I may even try to get done this week. We're on a break in Stitching Book Club, so I have time to read, so I'm trying to barrel through a couple as I can. It was published posthumously. Baum died in May of 1919, about a month before Magic of Oz was printed. So he did not get to see Glinda of Oz published. He did claim at the time he submitted Tin Woodman of Oz that he had enough material for a third one beyond Glinda of Oz. Most research turns out it looks like it was an omnibus edition of American Fairy Tales. So it wasn't actually an Oz book. Which is a real shame, because this is, I think, honestly, and I know I said for years Lost Princess and Patchwork were my favorite, Glinda of Oz far surpasses that. I think it's honestly the best book in the series. So it's, in some ways, really, really wonderful that Baum got to let off and finish on a really, really high note. Had Magic of Oz been the last book, that would have been a shame. So, Glinda of Oz. Glinda of Oz, this is my first time reading it. This was an interesting journey for me in a lot of ways. For one, we're 100 years from its publication, like almost to the day. It published, I think, about a week ago was its anniversary. It concerns Ozma and Dorothy learning by accident that there are two factions in the Gillikin country, that's up in that northern quadrant of Oz, that are about to go to war. The Skeezers and the Flatheads. The Flatheads are run by the Flatheads, for one, they have flatheads, and they carry their cans and their brains in cans. They're governed by a man known as Sudik, short for Supreme Dictator. It's very definitely a dictatorship. They do have magic because they were governed originally by the three adepts, who are these women who have their own branch of witchcraft that they study and know. They're about to go to war with the Skeezers, who live in this glass and marble-domed island in the middle of a lake. It's run by the evil Queen Coo-ee-oh. And Coo-ee-oh kidnapped the adepts, learned all she could from them, and then turned them into fish. So the Flatheads and the Skeezers initially were at war because the Flatheads kept coming to the Skeezers Lake and taking the fish. Now, unbeknownst to the Flatheads, the reason that Coo-ee-oh is so worried about this is the adepts cursed her for her betrayal and said, if any of us are destroyed, you will lose your magic. So, to avoid war, Ozma and Dorothy decide they're going to journey into these countries and they're going to put a stop to it. And we'll come back to that. Of course, things go awry. Coo-ee-oh is turned into a swan after she submerged the island with Dorothy and Ozma trapped on it. The Flatheads decide, well, hey, we've turned her into a swan, and now she's not really a threat anymore, so hey, we won the war! Huzzah! And the rest of the book is spent with Glinda, the wizard, and everybody trying to rescue Ozma and Dorothy from the land of the Skeezers, from their little island. The adepts are transformed back to their human form thanks to one of the Skeezers, Everick, and the magic of a Yukahu known as Rira the Red, sometimes known as the Red Rira, which was a fun chapter. Interestingly, and the original manuscript for Glinda of Oz is in the Library of Congress. And in that original manuscript, when we first met the Rira in the final version, she's a red ape with a lace hat and apron. In the original, she was supposed to be a skeleton with glowing red eyes, and someone at Riley and Lee probably said, that's a little scary. And this is not a very scary chapter, so let's change this. In some ways, I'm a little disappointed, because I think that would have been really cool to see what Neil would have done with that. However, as fun as that would have been, it would have been completely at odds with the rest of the story. So instead we get, it's Ervik, not Everick. So him meeting Vera the Red. And a lovely color illustration of Rira as the ape, and then as herself in black and white opposite. As always, it's kind of interesting to see the color plates, although unlike earlier books, particularly like Dorothy and the Wizard and Oz, none of the images really, if they weren't there, I'm not sure they would have been missed. In fact, weirdly enough, in chapter 21, we have a color plate of Trot dragging Scraps in, only to later, a few pages, have basically an identical black and white line drawing. So there you go. Ultimately, of course, Dorothy and Ozma are saved. The Skeezers get proper leaders who swear their allegiance to Ozma. The Adepts are returned to the Mountain of the Flatheads, who they then are given round heads, and their brains are placed inside their heads instead of cans. And Sudik becomes a normal individual, and the Adepts agree to rule over the Flatheads as well as pledge their allegiance to Ozma. It's a fairly straightforward plot. Baum does, sort of like he does with Emerald City, you get some back and forth, so every other chapter sort of deals with the different plots that are going on. It moves quick. There's no chapter that particularly feels like it's a waste. I don't know if that's because Baum was writing in a hurry to try to finish, or if it just so happened that this story he didn't want to embellish. I have a feeling, given his health, it was probably more out of necessity. Similarly, if you look at, not that Baum and Jane Austen are on the same level, I compare it in some ways to Persuasion, Jane Austen's final novel. It's a lot less dialogue heavy. There's a lot more exposition that's just sort of written away, where she would have taken 4 or 5 pages prior to that. So I kind of liken it to that. I think Glinda of Oz is a better book. I don't really care for Jane Austen. That's another story. The things, though, that are interesting about Glinda of Oz is it's borderline science fiction to a degree. There's a lot of elements of science and steam, what we would associate now with the modern steampunk movement. The story itself, Glinda is like a magic scientist. Instead of just, snap my fingers and it's done, she has to go and study and research. There's lots of uses of powders and specific magic words that aren't as prevalent throughout the series. There is some, obviously. There's the Powder of Life. There's the magic word in the Magic of Oz. But it's really dominant here, and I kind of think this is the direction Baum was beginning to take the series. And that's part of why I'm really sad that he passed before he could, because it brings in some really interesting notions. The island of the Skeezers is controlled entirely by machinery, big cogs and gears that are all under that you don't see. There are submarines that are used. So in a lot of ways, it's almost... It's both the magic that is magic itself, but it's also about the magic of science, which is really interesting to see. There's heavy discussions, or as heavy as a children's novel in 1920 gets, about the different forms of magic and how Ozma has fairy magic, which is very different from the learned magic of Glinda and the Wizard, which is even different still from the magic that the Adepts have, that Kuyo then bastardized into her own thing for her own evil machinations. So it's a really fascinating book in that regards, that you've got Baum in some ways almost seems like he's really beginning to world build. He's established rules before in the Oz world, but this one he really begins to coalesce the ideas. He brings back up the ideas of death for the human characters. He really does some very interesting things. However, it also brings up one of the more problematic things, and I don't know if this is my reading today based on the things that have happened over really a large course of this year, but in general, I don't know if it's me looking back over the last 100 years since this was published. This is the first one that's really post-World War II. Oh, excuse me, not World War II, World War I. Prior to World War I, the U.S.'s stance had been one of, you know what, I appreciate that you helped us, but we're isolating. We're not doing this. We're on our, I'm sorry, we're not contributing, we're not helping foreign countries with their wars. And in World War I, we suddenly changed that, and it became something totally different. And we actually started lending assistance to England and France to fight Germany and Italy and etc. But there's this strong notion of the Americans going in and usurping dictators and throwing them out and making them swear allegiance, which we like to do that. It doesn't always work. So in some ways, this book is idealistic, that if you put good people in charge, then everyone's going to be happy. And that Ozma is doing all of this for the good of her own people. And while in this instance, yes, there were two factions that were going to go to war with each other, and it would have been bad, did she really need to interfere? And they even discuss that. The only reason that they even become aware of this is Glinda's book of records. Dorothy and Ozma are visiting Glinda. Dorothy she's bored. And there's a whole lot of that in this book. Dorothy gets bored very easily. And she is reading in the book of records about this war that's about to start, and she goes, oh, hey, we should do something. So it brings into question, should they have left well enough alone? Obviously, in the world of Oz, and obviously in this instance, yes, they should have. But it's something definitely interesting to look at and consider with what America's stance became after World War I, and how much this may actually have influenced Baum's writing. We know for a fact that the suffragette movement, with Maude and her mother Matilda Jocelyn Gage, we know that played a very heavy part in a lot of this. In fact, if it's interesting that, again, when both of these countries are, sort of, their evil dictator is removed and someone new is placed in power, once again, it's women. It's the three adepts, and I'm not even sure I can try to pronounce her name. Lady Aurex? I'm not really sure. Or maybe it's Lady Aurex. I feel like that's a pun that I'm not getting. But whatevs. They're the ones that are placed in charge. Once again, we have a huge factor that women are the strong political leaders, and the men are not. So we know that influenced it. Part of me feels like maybe some of this was influenced by that as well. He was writing it in 1918 as the war's coming to an end. So, Amy, unfortunately, probably won't know for sure, because I don't know if any of his writings... No one was there to ask him, because... well, he was gone. That being said, though, it's a terrific book. It's one I would strongly recommend. It's one I would actually recommend after someone read really up through Dorothy and the Wizard. This would probably be one I would say if you wanted to skip the others, you could safely do that to read this one. Baum does there's one chapter that Baum sort of, when Glinda decides, okay, we've got to form a rescue expedition, where it sort of refreshes us on who certain characters are, like the Frogman and Scraps the Patchwork Girl. But by and large, it's a good, solid, well-contained story. I'm glad that Baum was able to finish on this one. So, like I said, this one's very quickly rose to being probably my favorite in the series. So, anyhow, that is it for Glinda of Oz. Yeah. So, I'm going to be starting the Royal Book of Oz tonight. With any luck, maybe we'll have a video on it later this week. We shall see. I don't know how far I'll get before we start Frankenstein with Stitching Book Club in August, towards the end of August. So we'll see how many I can get done in the meanwhile. So, anyhow, that's it for me. I will see you all next time. And don't forget, Road of Yellow Books on Instagram is my Oz book one, if you want to follow that. And the Yellow Book Road, the Literary World of Oz on Facebook. So, anyhow, have a great day, everybody.